Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of The Generalist, your number one source for all things general knowledge. I'm your host, The Generalist, and today we're going to be talking about sports again. I feel like it's something that we haven't really touched on in a while. We've been speaking about world events and crises and all of those things, so I thought we'd bring it back to where we started. Don't go watch that first video. I just leave it there because you want to remind yourself, hey, this is where I come from. So I'll leave it there. If you must, you can. I wouldn't encourage you to do so, however. But let's talk about today's video, and it's actually similar to the one that we did in the first episode or edition of the Generalist, and that is sports finance. But this time our angle will be a bit different. We're looking at it from the point of from a team basis, from a more holistic basis rather than the semi-serious look at how you can get rich through your child's athletic talents, so to speak. So, what are we speaking about today? I think you might have seen, if you are into the world of sports, or you look at, you're a finance guy or whatever it is, guy or girl, we don't discriminate here. You might have seen on the 21st of November, or towards the end of November, the Premier League had agreed a set of cost rules, but it's been mooted rather for some time now. Basically, it entails increasing competitive balance amongst the different teams, because there's the obvious concern amongst everybody that Manchester City, Arsenal, and the like get to run away with competing for league titles, to the point where, Manchester City has won 6 of the last 10 Premier League titles. And at some point, I think it was 4 in a row. I don't care. I hate Manchester City, so to speak. So I stopped counting. But the point is that a lot of the smaller clubs feel like the bigger clubs can just spend their way out of a mess and spend their way into success. So the league has tried to curb that. Initially, they tried to do that through a set of rules called PSR. It's abbreviated, which in full would mean profitability and sustainability rules. And they effectively sought to curb, spending over a period of time. It was calculated over a rolling 3-year period, and teams were not allowed to report a loss of about £105 million in that 3-year span of assessment. And this is a very rough view of the rules. It's just so that you can understand what they look like. And you are allowed to use other sources of income besides like football related revenue. Football related revenue, for those who might not know, would be money that's earned from TV, money that's earned from money that could be earned from commercial deals. So deals with Adidas, Nike, deals with Etihad or Emirates, or all those kind of things. And that money would then be counted as football related revenue. But you could also, with the PSR rules, you were allowed to add non-football related revenue. And this was something that a certain club that wears blue, a slightly darker shade of blue than Manchester City, that's also been a bit successful in recent in the last 20 years or so. They use this rule and they spammed it, like when you find like a move in like a fighting game and you just start spamming it so you can win as many fights as possible. This team did it. They didn't win any league titles though, for all their spamming. But they basically counted revenue from not revenue, sorry, but they basically counted financial benefits that stem from the women's team, as well as selling things like hotels and other assets, as a sign that they were healthy. They were able to spend a 10-figure sum, well, I think about £2 billion, if I remember correctly, by bending the rules to their liking. Obviously, the smaller clubs didn't like this, and they again fought, the powers that be in the Premier League to try and institute better rules. And we ended up having a meeting, and like I said earlier, these rules were mooted a long time ago. At the beginning of the year, there was a big discussion on them. There was a discussion on them last year, and people were effectively unhappy that the top six clubs, or the big six, that is, could use clever accounting, but also the fact that they couldn't match the commercial revenue streams. Like, for example, a club like Newcastle is probably the wealthiest, quote unquote, of all of the clubs in the Premier League, but they can't spend that money. For those who might not know, again, um, the Newcastle is owned by Saudi Arabia effectively, so they do have a wealthy Arab sugar daddy, so to speak, like Manchester City does. But because they don't have the quote unquote pedigree, they don't have the commercial revenue, they can't spend money in the same way, or they can't spend money in the way that Manchester City can, because the losses, you know without they can't spend that money with the losses, rather, put differently, without the revenue that comes from match day related or football related income that a club like Manchester City or Manchester United can. So, in order to solve this problem, you would have seen in November that the Premier League agreed to a set of new rules that will replace the PSR rules, known as squad cost ratio, or SCR. And these are different in from the PSR rules because Chelsea can't bend them to their will anymore. You can't use non-football related income to basically beef up your balance sheet, so to speak. Now you have to, it has to be match or football related revenue. So it has to come from commercial deals. It has to come from ticket revenue. It has to come from that sort of. It's been narrowed effectively, and instead of a 3-year period, the assessment period will go season on season, so it's year to year, and the rules will come into effect in 2026-27, so next season. And those rules, if put differently, they're much similar to the UEFA, well, or the rules that UEFA uses for their competitions. And it's basically that you can't spend more than 70% of your revenue, your football revenue, on your playing squad. If you go above, you face a penalty, and you have to stay within that realm. And the Premier League differs a bit from this in that they instead have decided to increase the the threshold that UEFA uses, and you can spend up to 85% of your revenue on your playing squad, and that includes payroll, and that also includes, if I'm not mistaken, transfers. So transfer, which previously was also included in the PSR rules, and transfer fees back then, or in the rules that until they end at the end of the season, they're amortized. Is very roughly put the process of spreading out a big fee or big cost over a period of time. So in this case, the transfer fees would be spread out over the length of the player's contract, meaning that they would be amortized, meaning it spread out over that period. So let's say you sign a 4-year deal at £150 million, being the transfer fee. That £150 million would be, let's make it 160 so it's easier, would be spread out to almost like 4 rather than the full 160 in the when it is paid, because obviously, or not so obviously, some of you might not know this, but the football transfers are rarely paid up front, especially the larger ones. So what would happen is, that's why a lot of negotiations tend to carry on as long as they do, because what would happen is that they would there'd be a disagreement over how those installments would be paid, or how much the club that is selling is receiving upfront. And sometimes the deal can break down over the structure or the way the deal is structured. So they were amortized, and then it also becomes that's how they would be calculated as per the PSR rules. So you still do get, if I'm not mistaken, those that benefit, the benefit of the doubt that is, and transfer fees are counted towards that revenue as match day or football related revenue, so to speak. And the difference being that, unlike with the UEFA rules, you can go over the 85% mark, but only up to about 30%. So you can only spend 30% more. And again, it's not for an indefinite period. Then you will incur a tax when you do so. It's called a luxury tax. So these rules are intended to sort of even the playing field, if you will, and make it a bit easier for the smaller clubs to catch up with the bigger ones. A lot of people are not happy. A lot of people wanted another rule, which was mooted in the meetings, which basically im- would have instituted a spending cap of about 5 times the amount that, or rather, put differently, is the club that earns the least or spends the least or the club that spends the most cannot spend more than 5 times the amount that the club at the bottom spends. Then there would be penalties for that. That rule was not voted in. It was not voted in because you need about 70% of, or 14 out of the 20 teams in the Premier League to agree to such a rule. So I was interested in seeing the argument through to the very end. The argument being, does does a spending cap, or would a spending cap change or make the Premier League a more even league? Will it make it more competitive? Will there be more Premier League winners if they decided to institute these rules? Or would it just be more of the same? And to do this, I'm going to compare it with leagues that do have a spending cap, namely the American major leagues. All three of them have some form of, a spending to various degrees. One league is almost non-existent, the other has one, but it's a soft cap that that's slightly more stringent than the league I just mentioned before that, with certain exceptions depending on situation and teams. And then there's a league with a hard cap. So the league with almost non-existent spending cap is the MLB, or Major League Baseball. The league that's in the middle is the NBA, because they have a luxury tax system, a soft cap, if you will, and you have certain exceptions, and it's tiered effectively. We'll deal with that later. And then we have the NFL, which is considered the gold standard of competitive balance in American sports, which has a hard cap system where everybody gets the same salary cap and there are no exceptions to the rule. So we will start by using the Premier League as a benchmark, and to the surprise of nobody, Manchester City is. But before I get into Manchester City, I need to give you a breakdown of how we will derive our metrics. Basically, we'll look at each league's average, or we'll look at each league's payroll from the team that spends the most to the team that spends the least. We look at the difference between them, which we will show with graphs. And then we will also look at how many different champions have been crowned over the past 10 years. And it's a very simple metric. I think we could go deeper, but I'm not an accountant, and finance and complex financial terms are not really my thing. So we're going to keep it simple for you and I, and we'll stick to those barometers to see if competitive balance really does shift, or does a hard cap and spending controls increase equality amongst teams in professional sports. So back to Manchester City. They are, as I said earlier, to the surprise of nobody, the highest spending team in the Premier League. They spend the most. And when we look at When you look at how much Manchester City spends, it is about 225, oh no, 220 actually million, more or less, pounds for the entire payroll. From That's basically every player's annual wage put together. They spend about 222 million pounds. That is about a fourth or less than a fourth than the team that spends the least. You would see Sunderland on your screen right now, but Capology also says that Brentford spends the least. So it depends on where you look, really, because their salary data, because a lot of clubs aren't listed, wouldn't be as readily available, and it's very murky water, so you will get slight variances from source to source. So that's about a fourth or even less, depending on where you're looking, than what Manchester City spends. And there we go. We've decided the video. There it is. Manchester City wins because they spend more money than anybody else, and they've done so for the last couple of years, really. And it shows because they won 6 out of the last 10 Premier League titles, right? Not so fast. Because when you look at this season's numbers, which we are actually, in case somebody was confused, uh, Brighton are fourth bottom, and they are currently sitting, at the time of recording this video, eighth in the Premier League. They could actually jump into the top four if results go their way. So what you can already glean from this is that the Premier League is not cut and dry. For example, I could even look at last season. The team with the third highest payroll finished 15th in last year, and the manager is still managing the club to a very but we're not here for that. We're here to speak about numbers, not my personal afflictions. And you see that in itself is not the end all be all. And you could even look at Everton, who are currently in 12th, and they are 7th now um, in the table, if I remember correctly. And but last season they were more or less in the same position. They were in mid-table in the spending or payroll table, yet they were very nearly relegated. And their results were bad. They barely made it, even accounting for the points deduction they received for falling afoul of the PSR rules last year, or in the period of calculation. So the Premier League, how many champions has the Premier League crowned, rather? And they've crowned about 6 or 4, actually. No, 4. It is 4. I mean, Manchester City won 6 of the last 10, but there have been 4 different champions in the past 10 years. The last being the first in this period being Leicester, which was admittedly a big surprise, and then followed by Chelsea the year then Manchester City went on a run. Liverpool won it, and Manchester City have won it again for a couple of years, and then Liverpool won it again last season. Very unfortunate for somebody who supports a rival of all these clubs, but such is the reality that we live in. Case closed. The Premier League is not competitive because some teams can spend more than others. But I'm going to look at another league, the MLB, and you'll see that number one, the Dodgers in 2025, with $350 million their payroll was in that period, about more than almost 5 times, really, as much as the team in last, which was the Miami Marlins. Um, it was it was a big gap. No ifs, ands, or buts. And it's reflected in that, the World Series was competed between, or was held between, the Yankees, who were the second highest team in that period, and the Dodgers, which was the highest paying team in that period. And the Dodgers won back to back World Series. And they still had the highest payroll when they won it then. So case closed, right? The Dodgers win and the Yankees win because they pay everybody more than everybody else, right? Wrong. Because when you look at the last 10 champions, you'll see that they've actually crowned the MLB, 8 different World Series winners in that time span. Some were high-paying teams like the Dodgers, who've won it the most in this time span, and some were less so, like the Royals, the Kansas City Royals, who were not as highly paying as the other teams. So it's really important that we look at this. Why that is? It's simply because what you do with your talent, your talent acquiring strategy can just as well affect, the success on the pitch. You don't just spend a bunch of money. Ask a Manchester United fan how much that money isn't everything. But we're not done yet. We're still going to look at the NBA. And when you look at the NBA, it's somewhere in between, the league that I'll mention after this. And you see that the curve, the gradient is less steep between, the team that pays the most and the team that pays the least. And before we get into that, though, it's important for us to look at the NBA structure. It's very roughly put. The first is that they do have a salary cap, and for this season it's about $154 million, and they have a luxury tax as well. So it's a penalty for teams that exceed the tax line. And for this season, it was $187.9 million. Then they have aprons, first and second, basically how those are the thresholds that you have for infringement. So higher spending thresholds trigger more severe building or roster building decisions. So if you break the second apron, for example, you would be limited from making trades. You wouldn't be able to exercise what they call a mid-level exception, which basically allows you to pay somebody at a mid-level without certain cap penalties. And then a team becomes hard capped when they can't exceed the second April if they've already used those mid-level exceptions to acquire certain players, or if they've exercised what they call bird rights, which allows you to sign a star player under certain conditions if their contract is up and it was up for renewal. So, but we won't get into those rules. They're quite complex. And when we look at the actual numbers, you'll see that the Cleveland Cavaliers, so one of the better teams in the league, have the highest payroll at about $211 million, while the lowest paying team pays about just under $141 million. And the gradient is not as steep as the ones that we've seen up until this point. And it's reflected in the amount of champions in the last 10 years. They've also have been 8 different finals winners in the past 10 years. And that is reflected of a league where you could say that cost measures are sort of working in the favor of those who don't have the benefit. I didn't mention this earlier about the MLB, but the MLB is a bit lopsided in part because of geography. You'll see that the LA Dodgers and the New York Yankees pay the most because of the way the um, contracts are structured um, for TV revenue. Unlike the other leagues which have national deals, the MLB has a very localized system. So it means that a team in New York could earn a way more money than a team that is based in Kansas City, for example, or a team that's based in Minnesota or Minneapolis, like the Twins are, because of there are less people, less eyeballs, and so there's less revenue to be collected from those people, and therefore those teams don't have the benefit of TV markets. TV markets are less of a thing in the NFL and NBA because of the way they structure their media deals. They're a lot more centralized, and so it allows them to not have as much of a lopsided commercial revenue. If you were to look at a commercial revenue table, you would see that there's less variance between the team that earns the most and the team that earns the least, which leads me to the NFL. But before we get to the NFL, you see that when we look at the two different leagues with very different payment profiles, payroll profiles, you will see that in and of itself, same amount of champions in the last 10 years, but they reached that very differently. And we will put a pin in that and move on to the gold standard um, of the competitive balance table, because like I said just now, team market size does not in and of itself determine big or size or success, if you will, because you'll see that there's a lot of storied franchises in the NFL that are from tiny, relatively speaking, cities. Like, for example, the Green Bay Packers are from a very small city in Wisconsin, Green Bay. The Kansas City Chiefs, who are a recent example of success, are also from a small city, Kansas City again, which is in Missouri. And what other team can I mention? I can't think of one right now. But but you get the point. I'm sure you get the point, right? Right? Anyway, those teams are usually hailed as successes. I was thinking of the Steelers, which also come from a relatively small city. Unlike, for example, New York, the two New York teams, while one of them, the Giants, which don't even play in New York, funny enough, they play in East Rutherford, New Jersey, if I remember correctly. But the two New York teams, namely the New York Giants and the New York Jets, have been terrible in the past couple of years. And so their positioning in the largest TV market in the US has borne no success, little to none, no bearing, little to none, on their success whatsoever. You could say the same of the teams that moved from, one of them is back, the Rams. The LA teams, they are now LA teams again. In fact, before we get into the current LA teams, which are decidedly more successful than their New York counterparts, teams actually moved away from Los Angeles. You would think that it would be important for them to stay in the second largest city. The Raiders were once a Los Angeles team, they moved away, and the Rams moved away in Los Angeles, citing the lack of boots or bums in stadium, bums on seats, as my pastor would like to say, bums on seats. It was the Coliseum, or was it the Rose Bowl? I'm not sure. It was one of those. But they moved away in the 90s, citing the lack of fan interest, because they were terrible. In that period, they weren't very good. No, wait. The Raiders were not very good, but they haven't been good for years. Regardless of where they've gone, they moved to Las Vegas now. They're just as bad as they were when they were in Oakland, and they were just as bad in Los Angeles. They're just bad. But the Rams were quite successful because the greatest show on turf, and again, I stand to be corrected there, but the Rams were slightly more successful in Los Angeles, yet they moved to St. Louis, which was a small city. They've since moved back to Los Angeles to get that all-important bums on seats and TV revenue, or usually in the NFL, it's just somewhere that they can get the general public to foot the bill for their stadiums, because billionaires don't want to spend money. And so they'll just uproot. And this is a historic NFL problem, where a team, if they don't get what they want from the local municipality, they'll just pack up and leave to a city that will pay the bill and will force the public to foot the bill for their shiny new stadiums. Such is the way of the billionaire, right? So, similar things have happened in Oakland, where the Raiders have moved to Las Vegas, and the Athletics baseball franchise is also uprooted and moved to Las Vegas as well. But back to competitive balance. That was just a bit of a nugget of information, if you will, because this is, after all, a general knowledge channel, right? So back to payrolls. The NFL having a hard cap system means that teams will obviously not try to exceed that cap. And you'll see when you look at the graph that it's the most level of the graphs that you've seen so far. And the team that spends the most because they've made terrible decisions is the Cleveland Browns. And they have spent about $300 million, most of which is paying off a player that doesn't even play for them and probably won't even play for them anytime soon. Oh, sorry guys, my throat is a bit, I know I've been clearing my throat a bit in this video. I've been trying to sort it out, but for some reason it just keeps coming back. But anyway, back to that team. That is the Cleveland Browns, who have been bad for as long as bad has been bad. I don't think they've ever been good since they restarted. They were formerly the Baltimore Ravens, were formerly the Cleveland Browns, and in a classic case of really wealthy guy not getting what he wants from the city, they uprooted and moved to Baltimore, changed their name, changed their colors, and they became the Baltimore Ravens. It seems that Art Modell, I think if I remember correctly, the owner of the the then Cleveland Browns, who are now the Baltimore Ravens, um, then must have taken their winning culture with them, because while the Ravens are one of the more successful franchises in the NFL in the last 30 years, because they moved in 1996, I believe, the Cleveland Browns have been terrible in the same time span. They just, like, they know how they if you know the phrase, stealing defeat from the jaws of victory. The Cleveland Browns have done that. They've never been good, save for like a few years. And the one thing that did make them, when they are good, they find a way to destroy that and make themselves bad again. But anyway, the Cleveland Browns spend the most because of the Deshaun Watson contract. Deshaun Watson, you might not know, you might know rather, if you are a non-football fan, that's what I wanted to say, that he got into a bit of trouble because he liked to do funny things during massages. And there was a massive lawsuit against him. And the team that had employed him at that point, the Houston Texans, decided to get rid of him. They sent him to Cleveland. Cleveland needed a quarterback, which, if you watch enough American sports or sports commentary, all those talking heads will tell you it's the most important position in sports. So the owner of the Browns decided it was worth paying somebody with questionable morals, or a questionable moral compass, a whole lot of money to come and play for him. Unfortunately, man with questionable moral compass hasn't been very healthy since he got into trouble with all those women in that massage issue. And the Cleveland Browns have basically sunk about $250 million on this guy, and they're still paying him now, even though he is not playing this season. And when he has played, he's been terrible. So they have the highest payroll, and the payroll at the bottom is the Pittsburgh Steelers that I mentioned earlier, a franchise that tends to be good, but a lot of people feel like they need to have a change. They're basically good enough to make it into the playoffs, but never good enough to win anything. And so they haven't won a Super Bowl in the last 15 years because they regularly hover around like 9 or 10 wins season on season. But they have the lowest payroll, even though they are one of the more competitive teams in the league. And in addition to this, you could also look at the draft system, where the team that's been the worst in any given year is given the opportunity to get the best players coming into the league in that given year. For those unfamiliar with the NFL or American sports, they use a draft system. So you don't just, when you're 17 years old, decide, I'm not going to go to school, I'm going to go straight to the league. You can in the NBA, because you can go to the NBA straight from high school, but the other two leagues generally don't allow that, because they have rules in place that say that you need to be out of school for at least, the NFL. The MLB, I believe you can, but you have to play in the minor leagues first before you go to the MLB. So in any event, you do have the the development period, if you will. So the NFL, you have to have been out of school for at least 3 years. So that means that usually you can only play when you're 21 because they finish school at 18. So, and they will then take the best players from universities because there's a college sports culture in the US, and those best players in that draft class. So let's say the players that were born in the earliest 2005 from next year and older will then be eligible to go. Then they will be drafted with the best or the best pick, with being the number one pick being handed to the team that had the worst record in that particular year. They can trade the pick for other picks or players or whatever because they don't have a transfer fee system. They have a trade system, so you can either trade players or picks, and then that team will then get to select the best player if they so decide. So that also is a way to try and bring about more competitive balance, in that if you are bad, you can get the best young players rather than the best young players who would naturally obviously didn't want to go and play for teams that win. They have to go, they don't really have a say in where they decide to play. So the draft system does sort of even out, and basically the challenge then becomes how good a front office or head office is at making personnel decisions, rather than simply spending your way out of mediocrity. And therefore, it is possible for a team like, what's the team? The Texans. Yeah, I'll use the Texans. The Texans were bad for at some point. After they lost Mr. Watson, they went through, even with Mr. Watson, actually. There was a time where they had a lot of injuries. They were terrible, and they just never got good for a few years. But they became good again because they made good decisions. They got good picks, and now they are a competitive team. They've made the playoffs 2 years in a row, and they look like they're going to make the playoffs again. Another team that you can say is a good example of this is the New England Patriots. They were the evil empire. We hated them all. If you were a NFL fan, I hated them because they they cheated, they won everything, and they didn't do it cleanly. The refs were on their side. Tom Brady would get decisions in his favor that were questionable at best, and they won. But now they've been bad, and we were all happy for the past 5 years when they were terrible, when Tom Brady left to go to Tampa Bay. They're not bad anymore. They have the best record in the NFL currently again. Why? Because they made good decisions, because they got good picks during their rebuilding phase, and now the evil empire looks like it is back again. Um, so you could say that the NFL is the gold standard of competitive balance, right? But when we actually look at how many different NFL champions they've been in the last 10 years, there's only been six. That's two less than the MLB, which, according to fans of teams like the Oakland, soon to be Las Vegas Athletics in the MLB, or the Miami Marlins, or those types of teams that can't spend as much as the Yankees and the Dodgers, they'll say that, that's why we need a salary cap. But they've been more World Series winners than NFL champions in the last, because most of the NFL champions have been either the New England Patriots, that evil empire, or the Kansas City Chiefs, another evil empire that looks like it is on the wane, under Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes. I hate the Chiefs less because Patrick Mahomes is black, black solidarity. But and by all accounts, Andy Reid just looks like a really nice man. Oh well, by all accounts, he is a great coach, but he looks like a really nice man. I'll show a picture of him now. Doesn't he look like, a sweet uncle? Those ones that'll give you a biltong, those uncles at church. There's some nice Afrikaans people at church, at least the church that I go to. They're not all bad. So he just looks like those types of guys. But they are also an evil empire. I really enjoyed it with my Dallas Cowboys, a team that hasn't won the Super Bowl since I was, how old? I think 6 months old. No, I was a baby, and I'm not as young as I look. But they have had every opportunity to do so because the NFL is, a cap league where your front office decides who win, what decisions they make to put themselves in a position to win. But as we saw earlier, that in itself doesn't determine competitive balance. And so we will close with that effectively the moral of the story for this is that the Premier League won't necessarily become this bastion of competitive balance simply because they instituted spending caps. You can look at a league like the MLB, which, like the Premier League, doesn't have a spending cap, yet there's been a new World Series winner almost every single year in the last 10 years. And some of those teams did not earn nearly or pay nearly as much as the teams that did pay a lot. And the NFL is still had dynasties, over that time. The Kansas City Chiefs and the Patriots won a bunch of those titles, with like the Eagles winning here and there. The Rams won one. The what other team? The Buccaneers won one. So that in itself doesn't determine competitive balance. What does or rather what we should consider, success is what your team's front office does, what the sporting director does, or general manager in American sports, the decisions that he makes, the players that they scout, the players that they decide to pay, and the players that they don't decide to pay, and the trades that they make, or rather the sales that you make in the Premier League, or the acquisitions that you make. That is a much bigger determinant of success than money in and of itself. Just ask a Manchester United fan, you're looking at one right now, what paying a bunch of players money to players can do. It doesn't really win you anything. We finished 15th with the third highest payroll. So don't think that spending cap will suddenly make Fulham or or Brentford a Premier League winner overnight. Maybe they could, but it's not as likely that West Ham or a team like that will suddenly become a dynasty because there's a salary cap. So don't or rather, my opinion, good decisions rather than a bunch of money is what decides a champion. And that concludes the very, very long video today. But it was something worth talking about, something worth delving into, and there was a lot of interesting moving parts. I could actually do an individual video with each and every single one of these leagues, funny enough, which is why this video is almost like 45 minutes long. But there it is. I hope you liked it. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Comment. Remember, interaction means more people. YouTube will think that you like this stuff, and I know you do. So comment so that more people. Don't be a gatekeeper. We don't like that around here. We want to share knowledge with as many people who have the ears to hear this knowledge that we're spreading here. So do so. Don't be stingy. And we will catch you on the next video. I think I know what we're going to be talking about, but I won't say it now because I might change my mind. But thank you for bearing with me. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you on the next one. Cheers.